What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is geopolitical analyst and forecaster Kamran Bokhari. Kamran is the Senior Director of the Eurasian Security and Prosperity Portfolio at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy and has served at the U.S. State Department and as a senior consultant with the World Bank. Kamran last came on the podcast a year ago to discuss the violence ignited by Hamas's October 7th attacks, the nature and scope of Iranian involvement, and how various regional actors, including Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Houthis, and Hezbollah, were exploiting the growing disorder for their own advantage as the Biden administration struggled to stabilize a region that was on the verge of another major war. That war has seemingly come and gone, leaving Iran's influence network along the Shia crescent from Damascus to Beirut, along with its proxies and affiliates, in utter devastation or full-on retreat. Assad's departure and the fall of his regime in Syria are the equivalent of a geopolitical earthquake and are already dramatically changing the balance of power in the Middle East. Kamran and I spend the first hour of this episode recapping these recent events, enumerating the key players who expect a seat at the table for any negotiation over Syria's future, why the center of gravity in the Sunni Muslim world is shifting from Riyadh to Ankara, and what all of this means for Iran and the strategic vision that has guided the Islamic Revolution since 1979. In the second hour, we go one by one through every major country that will be materially affected by the outcome in Syria. We discuss the consequences and opportunities for Turkey, the new threats and challenges posed to Israel, what this new reality means for the Saudis, the interests of the United States and Russia, and why al-Sisi's regime in Egypt may be the next major Arab government to come under pressure in the years to come. If you want access to that part of the conversation and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this timely and deeply informative conversation with my guest, Kamran Bokhari. Kamran Bokhari, welcome back to Hidden Forces.
Thanks for having me again, Demetri.
It's great having you on, man. I was telling you that before when I scheduled this, or when I was thinking about scheduling, and I was like, can I schedule Kamran again? He's been on the show like 10 times. And then I realized actually you've only been on the show twice before. And the last time was a year ago, but you've spoken to our Genius community regularly on Q&As. You were at our New York dinner, and you and I talk quite often. So it seems like we've spoken a gazillion times on the podcast, but that's only because you and I speak a lot. So I'm very excited to have you on. I think the first time I ever introduced you to our audience was for the October 7th attacks, or had you come on the podcast before that?
No, that was my first podcast, and you missed the DC dinner as well.
Yes, you were in DC as well. That's right. You were at our dinner in DC a year ago or so. So that was a phenomenal episode, the one we did after the October 7th attack. I think we recorded it on the 13th and published it like a couple days later. So it was very timely. And what I found incredibly valuable about that conversation, and what I think also our listeners really appreciated, is that while everyone was very focused on the attacks themselves and the implications for a broader war in Gaza, a war with Hamas, and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you expanded the frame to include the larger regional war between Israel and Iran. And that was quite prescient and helpful, I think, as a framework to guide where events occurred thereafter. And you came back on the podcast 3 months after that for an episode about the implications of a larger war with Iran, to explore that further. We are now a year after that conversation and recording this a week or so after, only a few days actually after Damascus has fallen to an alliance of rebel factions in Syria. Let's just do a quick recap on what has transpired over the last week or two for listeners who need that or want to understand that in more depth. And then we'll get into the significance of the events that are transpiring, the major players, and the larger implications for Iran, for the United States, for Israel, for Turkey, for the Russians, and for the region overall.
So, Demetri, most people, when they see or hear about events like that, they seem to come out of nowhere, and the emphasis being on the word seem. They do not come out of nowhere. It's just that most people don't pay attention and can't pay attention because they have busy lives. And I will say that even people who are into this space of geopolitics, international affairs, foreign policy, national security, they're just dealing with the day-to-day and lack the tradecraft to kind of basically systematically look at an issue, at a region, and then say, okay, I know where this came from. So having said that, look, Assad fell and fled to Russia where he's gotten asylum. I think it was yesterday. But I believe that it took like 9 days, roughly. I tried counting it yesterday, and I came up with the number 9. It was 9 days since the HTS group, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham group, which we'll call HTS for the purposes of this conversation and others, basically steamrolled out of its sanctuary in northwestern Idlib. That's a province in northwestern Syria, and made the run for the second largest city of Aleppo. I think that was 9 days ago. And having taken Aleppo and so fast and without much resistance, none that could be quantified as significant, was huge. And that sort of set the ball rolling and saying, okay, what next? So obviously your eye is on the prize, which is Damascus. But before you can get to Damascus, there are 2 towns on what is known as the M5 highway running between Aleppo and the capital city. So the next thing they got within a few days was the city of Hama. And then they moved yesterday, or I think it was the day before or 2 days ago, when they got Homs. And by Homs, it was really clear that, this isn't going to work out for the regime and its principal backers, Iran and Russia. So there we are. But there's a bigger context going back to the year-long conversations that you and I have been having, which is that the Iranians, if you remember, as I said in the first podcast, were behind the October 7 attack. And you and I debated at length, and our listeners can go back and sort of listen to that conversation for context. But my belief has always been that Hamas could not have pulled off the October 7 attack without help. And that help does not come from anybody else but the Iranians and Hezbollah working in partnership. So the Iranians basically, in my view, miscalculated badly, and that attack cost them huge. Why? Because it led to that broader war between Iran and Israel that also became direct in critical moments, where the Iranians lobbed the missiles into Israel and the Israelis retaliated with airstrikes of their own. The last one being, I think it was October 26th, which really devastated the air defense capability of the Iranians. But the most important piece of the puzzle was, decimating Hezbollah's leadership and its capabilities, forcing it to return to the homeland, Lebanon. Because mind you, that without Iran and Hezbollah supporting Assad, it was an opening. And this is something I actually predicted in an article on October 3rd, that, hey, with Hezbollah damaged very seriously, this could be an opening for the Syrian rebels, backed by Turkey. Turkey is eyeing this historic opportunity to push out the Iranians and fill the vacuum for itself in Syria. And so, lo and behold, within weeks, we saw that thing started to manifest itself. So that's sort of the context. In other words, The attack on October 7th led to a broader war that weakened the Iranian camp, its ability to support the Assad regime. The Assad regime, as we have now found, was weak to begin with, literally only being held together by the Iranians and the Russians. And with that gone, they had no will to fight. And that's why the rebels swept in and took over the country, which is a major geopolitical event of seismic and historic proportions.
So I want to dig into that, where this event ranks relative to other, let's say, wars or conflicts in the Middle East or regime change in the last 2 decades, Iraq, the Arab Spring, the war in Libya, the October 7th attacks, etc. But I'm curious to ask one more question about this relationship between Hezbollah and Assad. I have seen it written in many places by analysts that, and there seems to be a broad consensus here, that one of the reasons why Hezbollah was so badly infiltrated by Israeli intelligence is because of their operations in Syria after the onset of the Syrian civil war, and that they exposed their networks and methods to Israeli intelligence such that they were able to infiltrate and pull off this devastating attack, the beeper attack and the walkie-talkie attacks. Is that generally true? And so does that also speak to just the significance of the war in Syria overall in initiating a chain of events that has led to this new dynamic that's unfolding today?
Absolutely. Look, it's no secret that Israeli intelligence has assets, human assets in the Levant, particularly in Syria. And that really allowed them to have sort of an insight. And with Hezbollah, since 2011, starting to operate in a sort of a very forward-leaning way in Syria, basically being a key component of that entire architecture that the Iranians were mobilizing to support the Assad regime, that brought them into contact with, the Israeli intelligence assets. So it would be it would have been very foolhardy for the Israelis to not benefit from that intelligence penetration of Syria and the fact that now they had access to the Hezbollah network. To what extent there were elements within the Syrian regime who were providing intelligence to the Israelis is something that will be debated, something we don't have a whole lot of evidence on. Hopefully reporters in the time to come will be able to expose that now that the regime is gone. But it is something that is very logical. It explains a lot of developments, just sort of the way in which Israel began to pick off leaders at different levels, both civilian leaders and military commanders of Hezbollah. And then, as you mentioned, the pager and the walkie-talkie attacks and the locations of where they had their arsenal. Because the assumption was that Hezbollah was a formidable foe of the Israelis. And we saw this in practice. In 2006, that war was inconclusive. The Israelis could not impose defeat on Hezbollah. And that became sort of the net assessment, if you will, world over. That, hey, Israel can deal with Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Hezbollah is much tougher. But they proved that to be not true. And how that happened has been made. That difference was made by that intelligence that you're talking about. And I have no doubt that that intelligence came from Israeli penetration of Syria and, of course, Lebanon, but more so Syria.
I've also seen it said that Hezbollah's operations in Syria created a lot of enemies for their organization because they were complicit in Assad's actions against his enemies, against rebel groups, against Sunnis. And so that I think that to some extent also explains the subsequent weakness and their ability to be infiltrated. Let's switch now to just one more question about the significance of the events that are unfolding before we get into a conversation about the major players. You called these events historic. I asked you, or I said that I wanted to ask you where they rank relative to some of these other events that have also shaped the region. How would you answer that question?
I would say that this ranks higher than anything that you listed.
Including the war in Iraq?
Well, the war in Iraq was a game changer in its time. See, things are relative. The significance of different developments over, a long period of time, when here we're talking 20 years, The significance is shaped by the realities in the moment. At that moment, post 9/11, 9/11 was a huge event. Compared to 9/11, the Iraq war was much smaller. It was sort of like a theater of the global war on terror, albeit a major one. So if you compare 9/11 to the war in Iraq, then you say, okay, which was more significant? Clearly 9/11 was more significant. Now, if you compare moving forward, look at the present time. And what are the implications? Because you cannot talk about significance and you can't say what was more significant than the other without looking at the ramifications of each event. Here, what we've just seen is, and you can look at it from different angles. So the Russians have lost a nearly 70-year outpost in the Middle East, and particularly on the Eastern Mediterranean. The Mediterranean as a whole, they don't have any outposts in the Mediterranean elsewhere. So this was their play. And this regime was in place for what? Since 1971, that's what, 50 some odd years, 50 plus years. That's huge because, Bashar al-Assad, the recently ousted president, began his term in 2000, or, his tenure as the dictator of the country. Before that, it was Dad. And then if you look at, what this has done to Iran and the regional balance of power. First, let me talk about Iran. Iran has spent tens of billions of dollars over the past 40, 45 years trying to construct a contiguous sphere of influence on its western flank, extending from its borders, running through Iraq, Syria to Lebanon onto the Eastern Mediterranean. Yes, we can add in the Houthis, but this arc on the northern rim of the Middle East is what was important. Syria was a key component of this sphere of influence. The loss of Syria means not only is Hezbollah isolated now from Iran, Iran has no direct way of assisting Syria, because remember, when Hezbollah was established in the 80s, we keep saying it was established by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, the Quds Force, the Overseas Operations Arm. That is true. But it could not have happened without the active involvement of the Syrian regime, particularly its military and in intelligence. Mind you, in the 80s, Syrian troops occupied large parts of Lebanon. Even after they were thrown out in 2005, forced out after the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri and the US pressure from the Bush administration at the time, they only removed their foot soldiers, their troops, back into Syria. Their intelligence network remained there. That remained until the Arab Spring in 2011. And that's when the Lebanese or Hezbollah dependency and the Iranian dependency on the Syrian regime shifted to where now it was the Syrian regime that needed to get help from the Iranians and Hezbollah. And since then, they've been holding this thing, together and very precariously. Assad dodged the bullet in 2016 when the Iranians mobilized tens of thousands of militiamen on the ground from all parts of the region and beyond with the help of Hezbollah and close air support from Russian fighter craft. And that's how they were able to defeat the rebellion in that year, December of 2016. We're literally, 8 years away from it. That was 8 years ago. So Syria gone is akin to punching a massive hole in that sphere of influence. And now the Iranian position in Iraq and of its Shia-dominated government is also at risk, vulnerable, because of the cross-border demographics. Eastern Syria, largely Sunni Arab, with some Kurds in the north. Western Iraq, again, the Kurds have their region in the north, but it is Sunni majority, and it's an area that's been dominated by Shia militias since the defeat of ISIS. This is the same area in which ISIS created its caliphate, the core of its caliphate, cross-border. So the Iranians are worried with the Sunni rise in Syria, what is the future of the Iraqi Shia-dominated government in Baghdad? And that is essentially a collapse of the national security strategy of Iran. Lastly, last point on significance. People don't really sort of on a day-to-day basis sort of look back centuries. I'm one of those crazy people who do. And so if you look at what has been the case since the 1980s, Iran has been the most dominant force in Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Syria, and with Lebanon as well. Mind you, this was unprecedented in many ways. Why? Because this is the old stomping ground of the Ottoman Empire. It was the Turks who dominated this region for a long time, for hundreds of years. The Iranian regime's influence in these countries did not take place. A Persian power controlling this Arab territory did not happen throughout the history of Islam, at least. It was pre-Islam. The Sassanid Empire had influence in these areas, and it fought with the Byzantines before the rise of Islam. Throughout Islamic history, what we had for the last 40 years is, unprecedented. And the Turks have been waiting, at least this regime in Turkey has been waiting for an opening to basically roll back the Iranian influence and regain its influence on its southern flank in the Arab world. So by those estimates, Demetri, and this is huge. That's why I'm saying this isn't something that's just sort of one of those things that is a passing phenomenon.
So we're going to have a chance to talk about Turkey because that's an important part of the story. I want to actually take this opportunity to mention a few episodes that I think listeners should go back and listen to if they're interested in understanding the larger historical forces that we're talking about today. I've done a couple of episodes with Joshua Landis specifically on the U.S. withdrawal from the Middle East, as well as the relationship between Turkey and Syria. And this was around the time that Turkish forces moved across the border into Syria to take parts of Rojava from the Kurdish-occupied areas. I did an episode with Jake Hanrahan about this as well, and we've done numerous episodes on Turkey with folks like Soner Chaptai, Ryan Gingeris, and Nicholas Danforth and Ambereen Zaman. So those are all actually, I think, very useful for what we're going to get into. Before we talk about that, the one more question having to do with Iran's strategic vision. So we talked about the 1980s, the rise of Hezbollah. Is that where we would begin if we wanted to talk about the beginning of Iran's strategic vision to build this sort of informal empire or highway of influence from Bahrain or even Yemen to the Levant? And what would you say? I mean, when did the goal become explicit for what they were attempting to achieve? Or was it never really explicit? Was it just to gain influence and power and leverage in their relationship with the United States, in their sort of larger ideological battle with Israel? How would we understand what that strategy has been before we get into a conversation about what the new strategy will be now that they have lost a big portion of that informal empire?
So in geopolitics, there are certain things that are permanent, and largely nations are permanent, and their core land is also more or less permanent for extensive periods of time. So if you go back to antiquity, the most powerful Persian empire that existed, known as the Achaemenid Empire, and it controlled large, pieces of geopolitical real estate stretching to the Black Sea and even to the Mediterranean. That empire was invaded by Alexander the Great, and it suffered defeat. So the West is the direction in which the Iranians have, or the Persians have faced threats historically. I mean, we can continue down. We can come to the Sassanid Empire, which was the major Persian empire just before the rise of Islam and the Arabs, if you will. It fought for centuries with its rival, the Byzantines, that were ensconced in what is modern-day Turkey and Syria. So again, the West has been a threat. If you fast forward to the Islamic era and you see the rise of another Persian empire called the Safavid Empire, which was the empire that actually declared Shia Islam in 1501 to be the state religion. And you see modern-day Iran taking its shape in that era. This is the early 16th century. It too faced wars. Of course, it faced wars from Russia in the north, in the Caucasus region, but its major adversary or rival was the Ottoman Empire. And it was again coming from the West. From the battle space was literally Iraq, if you will, Iraq and parts of Syria at times. If you come forward in history, and from our point of view, go back to the 80s, you see Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the Ba'athist Iraq, invade Iran within like a year and a half of the founding of the Islamic Republic. So this isn't something that the Iranians are doing, because they just want some more territory. There is that, but before you can enjoy territorial gains, you have to invest a lot of resources, human and material, in order to be able to gain that sort of comfort zone. Until then, you are dealing with threats. You see threats and you deal with threats. So regardless of, this is why ideology and regime type and all those things at this level don't matter. What matters is, geography. I mean, we can go to any other part of the world and we can talk about it. We can talk about the Northern European, plains and how, Napoleon invaded Russia and then Nazi Germany invaded Russia. And it's sort of this invasion superhighway. So there's geography, there's demography, and there's sort of resources that one has to bring together to be able to say, why is it that an actor is behaving the way it is behaving? And so I think that is a more useful, far more, if you will, permanent sort of way of looking at conflicts. So the Iranians, what they did in the 80s was in keeping with this logic. This is a memory that doesn't go away, regardless of who the regime is and whatnot. These are basic realities that you have to deal with. The United States is secure because of the two oceans and a close relationship with the Canadians and the Mexicans. We don't have the problem of Europe. We don't have the problem of broader Eurasia. So these are things that are not supposed to be taken lightly. And I think that is why, after being invaded by Saddam Hussein and having an alliance with Saddam's rival and enemy, the Assads in Syria, who were also Alawites, part of the broader Shia orbit, that they decided, hey, we're going to set up this outpost in Lebanon. And they went after U.S. influence in Lebanon and created Hezbollah, taking advantage of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and completely exploiting the Palestinian cause as well. And basically using the weakness, the inherent weakness of the Arab powers to be able to expand their own influence.
So, as you were describing the incredibly challenging geostrategic and geopolitical and geographic environment of the Middle East, I was thinking about how I used to play the game Risk and how the Middle East was the hardest territory to actually hold on to. And then when you were describing Napoleon's march to Moscow and the Nazi invasion of Russia, I did a quick Google search for Fulda Gap of the Soviet Union. Sorry. I did a quick search for Fulda Gap, and I found that there was a board game in the 1970s that you could actually play. So people who are interested in kind of exploring this in a game architecture, there are table games that you can play. I don't know how popular these things are anymore, but so you can check that out. I don't know that we had a chance to really talk about the major players or parties yet. I mean, we kind of maybe mentioned them here or there. Who are the major players or parties in the Syrian civil war?
So it goes without saying Iran and Turkey, Israel, and those are sort of the three immediate ones. It remains to be seen how much Russia will remain influential. It will, but indirectly through the Iranians, through some, relationship with the minority communities, where they've had their air base and their naval port in the Syrian coastal region in the northwest along the Mediterranean. They will likely also work through the Turks. The U.S. is going to, because of being the sole superpower of the world and with major interests in the Middle East, will remain engaged, rhetoric and politics aside, on the part of the incoming Trump administration. As you and I have talked about before, governments and leaders do what they must, not what they want. And so, yes, Trump wants to withdraw from Syria. He may, but he'll have to find another arrangement for it. So the U.S. will still remain engaged. We haven't talked about ISIS. So
Kurds.
the Kurds are very useful ally for the Americans in the fight against ISIS. Now, is that utility the same? Will ISIS emerge? Can the Kurds be used against, Iran? The Kurds will be useful to counterbalance the Turks. So there's a lot of work that the Americans will have to do. So they'll remain engaged.
He did abandon them in 2019, did he not? And Trump, in other words, has given some hint of what his policy may be vis-a-vis the Kurds and vis-a-vis Turkey from his policies in his last administration.
So he said that he would withdraw, but he didn't. So, what leaders, particularly presidents in America, say, because we're a democracy and, everything is very transparent in terms of at least, the amount of political talk that we generate is probably more than what the rest of the world generates. And so it looks like he abandoned them. But did he actually pull out U.S. troops?
Well, didn't he support Turkish incursion? Didn't Turkey create like a 40-mile buffer zone into northern Syria? I don't remember what exactly. This is a long time ago.
Yes, he did that. But when we use the word abandon, to me, that's sort of a word that says, well, you're just sort of like moving away from your ally and you're abandoning them. You don't want to have any relationship and you've thrown them to the mercy of geopolitical winds, in this case, Turkey. I didn't see that happen. We still have about 600 to 700 troops in Syria. Mind you, those 700 troops don't buy the United States a whole lot of mileage. 600 troops are essentially a small task force that is designed to provide support in various ways, some kinetic support, but largely advisory, intelligence, air support, and of course, there is that symbolism that's non-trivial. But to say that the withdrawal of those 600 troops will create sort of some, huge difference, well, one has to ask the question, what are they doing there that will be disrupted and who will be doing what they were doing or not? So it's a debate that needs to be had. There are other players. We haven't spoken about the Israelis. I mean, the Israelis' first order of business has been to counter this growing threat from this Iranian sphere of influence on their northern flank. And this was the biggest national security threat they had. Rolling that back has had an unintended consequence, which is the fall of the Assad regime. In a perfect world, the Israelis, as well as the Arabs and the United States, would want Assad not to fall because of the chaos that is now ensuing and will ensue in the weeks and months and years ahead. But how do you do that? How do you roll back Iranian influence and then still retain Assad? It's not possible. As we spoke before, that it was the Iranians on the ground, far more so than the Russians.
I mean, I've even read analysis that shows that Assad was concerned about Iranian influence in his own country and his ability to control it. That's how powerful the Iranians were.
Exactly. And mind you, the reports about, once Aleppo fell, there were reports circulating that the US and other players in the region have said, hey, if you dump Iran, then, we might be able to do a deal. Well, what does dumping Iran look like? Can you dump Iran? How can you dump somebody that is protecting your government? And the rebels are already in control of Aleppo. So we're like at game over. So these kind of things come out in the media. They make very little sense analytically and strategically. But the Israelis now have to deal with, they have sort of in many ways gotten rid of Shia radicalism and now find themselves dealing with Sunni jihadism. And therefore, it is no surprise that they're conducting airstrikes on what used to be weapons facilities that the Syrians controlled, the Syrian regime. They're still going after, potential movements of Iranian forces that may beef up Hezbollah in Lebanon, but I think that will become less and less. Their biggest thing is that they're trying to create now a buffer zone. They're playing it down. The reports quoting IDF official says it's not too extensive in terms of the area, the square mileage, but this is northeast of the Golan Heights. And so the Israelis need to know how to manage this new Syria with its chaotic, sort of dizzying kaleidoscope of groups. Mind you, HTS is just the leader of many other Sunni Arab Islamist factions and non-Islamist factions as well, if you look at the rebel landscape as a whole. They have to reach a power sharing arrangement amongst themselves. Then they have to work with the minorities, particularly the Alawites, who've been sort of the ruling elite or the community from which the ruling elite came from. Then they have to deal with the Kurds who occupy a sizable amount of area in the northeast and east. And so this isn't going to be a chaotic place as far as from an Israeli point of view. How do you make sure that it doesn't affect your borders? It doesn't spill over. So yes, there were those amongst the rebels, the Sunni Arab Islamist rebels, who actually celebrated the killing of Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah. And it wasn't just his killing, it was the weakening of Hezbollah that they have now benefited from. But it's not like they're going to be, less hostile to Israel. It's just that at this point, they have too many things of their own to sort out before they become a threat for the Israelis. Hezbollah and the Syrian landscape and Iran had built themselves up over decades, and that's when they became a threat. These guys are not there yet. So the Israelis have some time before this, and they're going to use that time to make sure that whatever emerges can be somehow managed. They're not going to do it alone. They will need to reach out to the Turks. They don't have a really good relationship with the Turks. They will have to work with the Saudis, the UAE, with Qatar. They will have to work with the United States. So this is going to be a long work in progress. So the Saudis and the UAE and Qataris are removed because they don't have their own military power. The Qataris will work through the Turks because they're their allies. The Saudis will try to manage, this newfound relationship with Iran and try to deal with Turkey. But there is going to be like an intra-Sunni struggle now. Why? Because the interests of UAE and Saudi Arabia do not align with the interests of Turkey and Qatar. Turkey and Qatar are happy to use Islamist factions for their purposes as instruments of their foreign policies. The Saudis and the UAE see this as a threat. Now, before I end this thought, I do want to say something that may sound provocative, but the fall of the Syrian regime has me and probably many, many others wondering, definitely the Saudis and the UAE and the Egyptians, that what is the future of the Egyptian regime? Is this the beginning of an Arab Spring 2.0? So what does that mean? I'm not saying that there's complete similarity. On the contrary, there is complete dissimilarity between the conditions in Syria and Egypt. But you got to wonder that if Syrian people overthrew a dictator, that has a large symbolism. And so what happens to Sisi? How do the Arabs make sure, the Arabs, I mean the Saudis and the UAE, who are underwriting the Egyptian regime, how do they make sure that nothing similar happens there? I bet you that in some corner of MBS's mind, he's also worried about his own people. He has 35 million population. He doesn't have the luxury of small populations like the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain, and Kuwait, and Oman have. So he must be wondering about the future. It's not immediate, it's not urgent, but it has to be somewhere in the back of his mind.
But also, wouldn't an Islamist revolution built off of Sunni Muslims be a potential threat to Saudi Arabia?
Absolutely.
Because of the extremists in their own country. So we'll have a chance in the second hour, listeners should know. We're going to go one by one. We're going to dig into the Israeli short-term and long-term interests. We're going to do the same thing for Washington, for Turkey, for Iran, for Russia, for Saudi Arabia. So one more question before we move it to the second hour, Kamran, and that has to do with the rebel factions in the north. We haven't really talked too much about them. You mentioned HTS. This is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and its military leader is Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani. We're hearing a lot about him. He is the leader who entered Damascus and prayed, knelt down on the grass. He's seen in videos and in pictures kneeling down upon entering the city. He's a really interesting character. And I encourage people to find it through the intelligence report, because I will have linked to an interview that he did, I think in 2021 with PBS. Otherwise, they should be able to find it if they Google it, where he sort of speaks at length about his biography. He was born, I think, in Saudi Arabia. And in fact, I've heard that he has a slight Saudi accent. And then eventually moved back to Syria. He was radicalized during the second Palestinian Intifada, like a lot of these young men, and then followed the track of the 9/11 attacks. And then the with the invasion into Iraq, went into Iraq to fight the United States. During his time there, I believe he was in Abu Ghraib, where I believe is where he met Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who would become the head of ISIS. At this time, they were all part of the Al-Qaeda network. But he has emerged as a bit of a pragmatist. And this is also part of an interesting transformation of Islamic revolution from this sort of transnational terrorism to something that's more focused on sort of building a caliphate or taking over countries. Who is this guy? What do we know about him? And what is his relationship with al-Baghdadi, and how important is it to understand who he is today?
So there's a fascinating piece on the magazine side of the enterprise that I belong to, New Lines. It's called newlinesmagazine.com or newlinesmag.com. And there's a great essay by my colleague and friend and the founder and editor-in-chief of New Lines Magazine, Hassan, who's also written a book on the ISIS army in Syria. He's from Syria. That essay is about Jawlani and HTS. It's a long one. It's co-authored with his co-author of his book, Michael Weiss. And so that, I would urge listeners to go read that piece because it'll do far more justice than we can here in the few minutes.
I'll put that in the intelligence report as well.
Yeah. And so Jawlani is interesting for me because I did my PhD dissertation on the mechanics of ideological and behavioral transformation amongst Islamist radicals. And so that was my entire PhD on. And I looked at the Afghan Taliban and I looked at a Salafi group, nonviolent social movement in Egypt called Hizb ut-Nur. It was the political arm of a wider religious social movement called Adawa Salafiyya. Became very prominent during the early years of the Arab Spring. It's still out there, although conditions for it to actually sort of do politics just don't exist. It is supportive of the Sisi regime, mind you. And so for me, people like Jawlani are very interesting. So what takes you from first being in Al-Qaeda, then briefly being part of the broader ISI, which is, the Islamic State of Iraq. And then when it becomes Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, you say, no, I'm still with Al-Qaeda. And I have a different group called Jabhat al-Nusra. And you sort of become enemies of Baghdadi, who you were formerly working with under the Al-Qaeda umbrella when it used to be AQI and then became Islamic State of Iraq. But once the Arab Spring uprising happens, the principles of the Islamic State of Iraq, who want to build this caliphate and have had strategic depth on the, in eastern Syria amongst the Sunnis and people like Jawlani is evidence that they joined them. So he leaves all of that to form his own group, and it's called Jabhat al-Nusra. And you see a bit of metamorphosis taking place where he is now repositioning himself as what I have called in my book, nationalist jihadists, not having to do with anything but their own country in which they operate. This is like the Afghan Taliban. They're not completely nationalists. They have the linkages with transnational. I don't want to minimize that. But if you want to look at the agenda or the scope of operations, or what we call technically in the military intelligence world, your AOR, your area of responsibility, I think it's pretty much clear that this guy very early on, after emerging as a player, said, I'm worried about Syria and I don't care about anything else. And he managed to survive where others did not. There were many, many other Salafi jihadi Islamist factions, literally dozens of them in the heyday of the Civil War. They all dissipated. His group fought the more hardline elements who wanted to be with AQ and then formed a separate faction called Huras ad-Din. He definitely fought ISIS, but he survived and he set up this semi-self-rule area with the help of the Turks in Idlib. And so you can see sort of this guy moving away from ideological prescriptions to practical reality. And practical reality is survival and then, expanding your influence. And the fact that he is now leading, before I joined your episode for this recording, I saw something. There is a statement from his group HTS that they've appointed a prime minister of their interim government. For him to be able to do that and to lead this will be the vanguard, his group HTS, to be the vanguard of this rebellion and overthrow of Assad and his regime, speaks volumes of the journey that he's made. Now, the problem is we don't know anything but his promises and his statements and his PR. How will he actually behave? Maybe he wants to, have this sort of broad-based national unity government, if you will. But does everybody else with him want that in his group and in the other factions? There is the Syrian National Army as well in the north. You have the people in the south, in provinces of Suwaida and Dar'a and the areas along the Jordanian border. Those are different groups. Then do the minorities or even people who are Sunni Arab who don't like Islamists, do they trust you or do they fear you? We already have the example of the Taliban saying, we're going to be very pragmatic. We're going to, we want to have normal relations with the world, but look at the way they're ruling. Now, definitely, the Taliban are a different animal than HTS. Very different. But there are broad strokes and there are geopolitical conditions in which both operate. And there are similarities there that will shape their future behavior. Difficult to tell, but I just wanted to lay out all the constraints there.
Yeah, so a few comments, a few responses to what you said, and then I'm going to move us to the second hour. Jawlani comes across as unusually intelligent and unusually diplomatically astute and politically capable. The way that, and I'm basing this almost entirely off of this very lengthy interview that he gave for PBS, and I read it only in transcript form. I don't even know if there's a video or audio that exists publicly. He comes across very differently than the Taliban. Again, I have no knowledge of whether or not he's sincere, but he certainly does seem to be interested in exercising power and in doing so effectively. And he does seem to be a pragmatist.
People like that don't just sort of self-generate. They're interactions with others. And so the question is, to put it bluntly, who groomed him? And I can think of two actors, Turkey and Qatar. And so, in other words, he's had help. He was a promising individual who had these qualities that they could build upon to turn him into a mainstream leader. But by themselves, nobody can just go from being a transnational jihadist to the new leader of Syria that wants to do business with the world.
No, thank you. And once again, you did what you did more than a year ago when you were on the podcast after the October 7th attacks, and you're widening the aperture to really show listeners the larger game that's being played here. So I'm going to move us to the second hour, and we're going to have a chance there to discuss this new dynamic between Turkey and Iran and Turkey's larger strategic role in the Middle East as a result of the vacuum that has been created with the fall of Assad's regime. Because, for as long as I've been following the Middle East, the dominant poles between Sunni and Shia were between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So also it'll be interesting to talk about Saudi Arabia, what effect this has there. Of course, we'll talk about America's interests, speculate a bit about the Trump team and sort of where they may fall on this based on who some of the players are in their administration. Israel, what is the short-term impact for Israel? It seems in the short term, there's a case to be made that this is a positive. In the long term, does this just become a negative? And is there really any optimal outcome for the Israelis? I mean, it just seems like every option ends up being bad for them. And then we're going to also have a chance to talk about the new strategy for Iran. I mean, if this seems like a major blow to the Iranian informal empire and its proxies and its network and this Shia crescent that we described earlier, what is the new strategy? What threat does this pose to Iranian stability? Not because Sunni factions are going to invade Iran, but because Iran has its own challenges. It's coming up on a historic power transition. I think Khamenei is 87 years old or some. He's very old. 85. So he could pass any day. And so who will take power there? That's a conversation you and I have had before. And then we can also talk about the implications of this for Egypt and the stability of its government, as well as for the Russians. And what this also tells us about the strategic own goal that Russia suffered with its invasion of Ukraine, whether or not we can discuss whether that was good for anybody else or not. It certainly wasn't good for Ukraine. I don't think it was good for the United States, even though Some have argued that it is, but it certainly wasn't good for Russia. So we're going to have a chance to talk about all those things in the second hour, Kamran. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Kamran, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. Kamran, stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.